All right, so I didn't anticipate that I would be cut off, but I was cut off, so I'm just going to jump into part two right now. Um, yeah, and so the Spanish, they have a really good military unit called the Tercio, which is a block of gunmen who have swords and spears, pikes, and it's kind of like an innovation. No one's really ever seen it before. It's like the first tank or something. And they are maybe a little less interesting than that, but it's no one's ever really dealt with it before. So on the battlefield, the Spanish are the best they really have ever been in their history. Like the best possible unit. They have all this money that can fund nice armor, nice weapons. And the Austrians are entirely in cahoots with the Austrian, imperial families are entirely in cahoots with the Spanish imperial families. And the reason for this union is it's kind of dicey all its own. There's actually several wars located mostly in northern Italy, but it was between French forces and their allies and Austrian forces and their allies. And it was wars over inheritance rights for large parts of Italy. And so they're actually fighting over Italian land, but they were doing so with giant um, armies from all sorts of parts of Europe, and sometimes not necessarily Europe, but for the most part, all over Europe. And of course, the Venetians were involved, the Florentines were involved, all these city states were involved on one side or another, and sometimes they would switch sides. The Pope was even involved. Like they're all involved, and they're feuding over an important inheritance claim that was largely just sort of a muscle flexing operation at least at the beginning, a matter of pride. And eventually the Spanish win, and so they gain a lot more land, and they gain this important not just alliance, but an association with the Spanish Empire, which had risen at the time. It was a nuevo homo, or as it were. It was a rising force and a phoenix. And so the Holy Roman Empire is exceptionally powerful now. Basically, it's an entire entity of of disparate ethnic groups in Europe, encircling France and almost gobbling it up. And the only real ally that France has is the Turks. Now, of course, England is not really decided yet who to side with, but it looks like they're going to side with Charles from the Holy Roman Empire. Why? Because he was the most he's the ideology of the time was might is right. If this guy has all this land and all this success, then he's probably the better person to side with. This idea, like very like kind of Protestant sort of revolutionary idea from the Enlightenment and Reformation, that like, oh, I'm just gonna pick the underdog because that person has been abused. That wasn't mainstream thinking. And so guess who? Henry VIII is gunning for approval from Charles, but of course, I think it was the mother or the wife of the King of France who was in prison at this time. He was in prison after the Battle of Pavia, and she had a meeting in secret, like a very low key meeting with Henry VIII. Like, hey, you don't want to side with this guy. I know you're trying to invade France and go to war because you think it's gonna, the Pope will like it. Because France also had its own, rival Pope at the Avignon and all this. So France and the Pope didn't always agree. But this woman basically tells Henry VIII, or so the story goes, that hey, you don't want some one guy out of Spain just ruling the whole world, right? And so Henry VIII was like, huh, I guess you're right. All right, I won't side with him. And overnight, he became like this sort of rebel. And then later on, he forms the Church of England and moves away from the dominion of the Spanish Empire. And the famous phrase that originated in the Spanish Empire was "the sun never sets" in the Spanish Empire, which was the only empire I think in history where that would have been true. Until of course later empires, but that was the first one. And it was also, I think, the largest empire in that's ever existed, or one of them. At the time, it had been. And so yeah, so you could say that this is the height of the Holy Roman Empire. Is their sort of their family is installed on the Spanish throne, which is kind of crazy. And inevitably there's a fall from grace and they get weaker. And what happens actually is that the Catholic foothold in Europe falls apart because of all the money that's going into Catholic lands in the South. Not Catholic lands, but um, Habsburg lands or lands that have more of a good relationship with the Pope. I mean, families have a better relationship with whoever the Pope is, which isn't anything new, but it had just been going on for so long that had gotten worse and worse and worse. And by the time of Martin Luther, who remember lives far up in Germany, in Wittenberg, he's operating out of Wittenberg. By his time, his heyday, they the Catholic Church was just basically sponging money for its operations all over the world, and not just church operations, but just all sorts of nefarious hidden operations. And it was kind of obvious if you thought for 2 minutes about it, it'd be like, yeah, they're probably not spending all this money on you know on the on like feeding priests and feeding the nuns. They're spending their money on warships, and they're spending their money on palaces, and they're spending money on just like weird dinners that no one needs to eat with like swan roasted swan and you know you know exotic spices, silver chalices for wine, like all these decadent things. And so Martin Luther is actually a very wholehearted guy. He just believes that he's just a little ignorant of the fact that he's creating a movement that is never gonna end and is gonna last seemingly forever, at least 500 years, and undermine Christendom. He's not aware of that as much as he's not. He doesn't seem aware of it. If he is, he doesn't seem aware of it. But he does seem aware of is that he wants a better version of the church, and he creates one. And so do other people, by the way. And not only do those other people create good versions, but there are people in faraway lands that copy them. And so the Protestant Reformation, in various murky kind of maneuvers, takes over like half of Europe. And that sounds like it would be kind of awesome, except for the fact that Catholic societies. Now, the Holy Roman Empire, as it was known as the 30 Years' War, which fought Protestant representation in smaller dioceses or smaller principalities, or even like counties, duchies, right? And so these baronies basically are deciding we're a Protestant barony, we're Lutheran. They didn't really use the word Protestant so much; they just called it Lutheran or Methodist or maybe Anabaptist, although that was less conceivable because they were more maligned. But it took a lot. Some of these denominations were not allowed to exist, even alongside the Lutherans and the Calvinists. John Calvin was a big, important guy in Switzerland, but also in Scotland and other places, and in the Netherlands. Because certain places they just didn't want to be Catholic or Lutheran; they had to be something else, so it became Reformed, which is the word for Calvinist. And as much as a lot of the battles in the 30 Years' War were fought in Germany in Holy Roman Empire mainstay lands, they before the 30 Years' War even kicked off, and there was different phases of the war. Some were more concentrated in like Bohemia, some were more concentrated in Germany. Eventually, the Scandinavians got involved, and the French betrayed the Catholic faction for reasons that are a lot more to do with their power bids in the world than have to do with their actual religious tendencies, or at least seems so. The French betrayed the Catholics, and that was another thing that led to the downfall of the Holy Roman Empire. Is that they had been historical enemies of the French, but during this war, they relied on them extensively for fighting in Germany. And the French were like, "You guys we're not even really on your side. The Imperial Army of the Habsburgs, we're not on your side. The Pope's army, we're not really on that side because we just had this giant war for decades in Italy trying to beat you guys. So we're not gonna like just let you win the 30 Years' War, which was the bloodiest war that Europe had ever seen at the time, and also one of the nastiest in terms of burning down houses and plagues being spread around, and demographics shifting, and architecture being ruined, and treasures being lost. It was basically like a prequel to the World Wars. It was just really devastated, and mostly in Germany. I mean, Germany was hit especially hard by the ravages of the 30 Years' War. But before the 30 Years' War even kicked off, which is hard to think about because the 30 Years' War seems like a long time, but there was the 80 Years' War, which began with the Dutch, again, the Holy Roman Empire, rebelling from the Spanish. Now, weird thing is that the Dutch were part of the Holy Roman Empire with the Austrians. They didn't really seem to mind that because that was just part of the lands that were traded with different alliances and marriages. Inheritances were crossed and crisscrossed. So the Dutch lands became part of the Holy Roman Empire under the Austrian Habsburgs. But once the Spanish got really involved, the Dutch had to start playing second fiddle, or not even second fiddle, like third fiddle. I mean, they had to just kind of be the whipping boy of the Spanish because they were the ones with all the colonial wealth. And so the Dutch resented this because they didn't want to pay taxes to them. And this has nothing to do with Martin Luther. This is political. The Dutch did not want to pay imperial taxes. They didn't want their religions, obviously, to be controlled, but they also didn't want the money going to their overseers. And they had an increasingly vicious revolt, a fervorous revolt that came to be known as the 80 Years' War. And it was an independence war, and the first of its kind in the world, the first war to establish a democracy in Europe. And it was actually the basis for the American Revolution. A lot of people don't know that because Americans are so egotistical. They don't teach this. But the Dutch revolt against the Spanish was the basis for the American Revolution. And the stadtholder of the Netherlands, famously William of Orange, he actually ended up being King of England and the stadtholder of the Netherlands, and he was sort of the king of both, running effectively the king of both countries. And the Netherlands, by force of their guerrilla tactics and their sort of naval skills, they were able to defend their like canal cities, a very aquatic cities. They were able to defend them from the Spanish armies that were sent north and established an incredible amount of freedom. Now, the reason they earned this freedom, I think, was because, like I said, Charles V was a northern guy who was installed on the Spanish throne and ran both Habsburg and Spanish empires at their respective heights. But he was a Dutchman. Like his family was raised in the Netherlands, and so the Netherlands was like not, with respect to the Austrians, the Netherlands was not like some low grade place. The Spanish just didn't really care about it that much, but the Austrians cared about it. And in fact, the beginning of Austrian supremacy in the world starts with their inheritance of the Netherlands during the Burgundian Wars, which goes even further back into the 1300s. But with Charles the Bold and Philip the Good and the Spider King of France, there's a whole different conflict here that did actually relate to England in a rare instance where England sort of allied with the Burgundians, and Joan of Arc was captured by the Burgundians, who were agents working for the English, and they executed her in the name of the English crown. So the Burgundians did not like the French. The Duke of Burgundy thought he should be the King of France. And once the Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, inherited all this land up north that wasn't really in Burgundy down south, that was separated, he was like, I can revive Lotharingia. I can bring back the middle kingdom of Charlemagne's three kingdoms that he gave his grandchildren. And so Charles the Bold tried to do this. He failed because it was a task no one could really do, but it signified that France did not deserve to be France to some people. And the Austrians took advantage of this, and they really cleverly married into that Dutch and Burgundy sort of family, that branch of their Burgundy family that had the Netherlands and Burgundy. They called it the Lowlands at the time. They didn't really call it the Netherlands. It was just the lowlands up north because it wasn't mountainous. It was at sea level, and just about. And pretty much all of it was around sea level. So they called it the lowlands, and always an important place in the European economy. There's this myth that the Netherlands was just like recently important. It's always been important. It's just they kind of have a way of hiding their relevance, um, and it pops out of nowhere when it's neglected the most. So anyway, that's the backstory for the Netherlands. And so now they're partners with the Austrians, and it's going pretty harmoniously. They're actually both getting a lot more power from it. But once Spain is in charge, because Spain did deserve to run the show, it had all this colonial wealth, and it had a lot of passion for instilling Catholicism in the world, which was a popular idea then and now. Um, the Dutch, for whatever reason, had to stick up their butt, and they're like, "No, you guys aren't as cool as you think you are. We're going to go to war against you, and we'll prove that we deserve our own place in the world. Finally, we'll be our own unified government." And they were never like a famous kingdom, but what they became was the first major democracy in the world, I think. Obviously you have the merchant republics of Venice and stuff, and Pisa or whatever, like Genoa, right? These San Marino and stuff. I don't know. It's a little insipid because that's all in the name of like an island, a city state, right? They're trying to be like ancient Greek city states, and they're trying to make money through commerce, and that's a strategy that's impressive in its own right, but very different from a large country. I guess by modern standards, it would be medium sized, but back then it was a large country, deciding to be totally republic, just like the Romans. And everyone's copying the Romans in different ways. So the Holy Roman Empire, for sure, is not the only country trying to copy the Romans. They're all trying to copy in different, and they tend to copy in their own types of ways. No one really copies the exact same way. The Spanish kind of copied with the colonialism, the military occupation stuff. They're the ones who led that. The Holy Roman Empire copied with the majesty, the "oh, I'm the emperor, I run the show, I have all these different groups of people," the majesty of the Roman Empire that HRE copied. And then the actual republic was a Dutch thing. But to be fair, sometimes it wasn't as much of a republic as it might look like. And that's also true of Imperial Rome. Now, Rome was a republic before it was an empire. There's a famous civil wars leading from republic to empire in Rome. And the Dutch were probably trying to be more like the original republic for sure. But at times they could be more of an empire too, especially with that whole twin monarchy thing with William and Orange and William and Mary in England. Anyway, England is out of the equation. England is having a civil war, so it doesn't participate in the 30 Years' War, and it's got its own thing going, so it wouldn't make sense for it to. It's basically neutral, and they're fighting over monarch versus parliament, so it's not even extremely obviously about religion. It is about religion, but not as obvious. Whereas the ferment, the high stakesness is still going on in borderlands of France and Germany, the breadbaskets of Europe. That's where all the fighting is going on. And the Dutch kick-started the whole thing, and eventually it was a rebellion until all these other countries got involved, and then it became like a multi-nation war. The only real war that was based on ideology and had comprised multiple language groups, since anyone could point back to in their family tree. Like there hadn't really been like the 100 Years War wasn't really that high stakes. The invasion wars from the Vikings were not really as I mean, a lot of the are crusades that had nothing to do with Europe. And in fact, Europe is really peaceful compared to modern in the last 500 years. Like in like from 1000 to 1500, Europe was a lot more peaceful than from 1500 to 2000. Just just it's statistically obvious. And so anyway, so the Middle Ages is religious strife and division is everywhere. Rampant standing armies are running over Europe. Colonial money is flooding in. The colonies are getting increasingly more as the government systems in the New World are not as effective as they were originally. And what happens is the Spanish betray the Austrians over time on a diplomatic basis over French and the Prussians and there's a succession crisis where Charles is, I think, the third of Spain, or Charles the second, I think the third, and he has no male offspring, and and so the Austrians, the best they could do is make a claim that we have, oh yeah, we actually, the Spanish crown belongs to have an heir, because that was the original family anyway. So like we have an heir. But then the French took it upon themselves with perhaps a fabricated document. Probably not. That, oh no, we the Bourbons are the ones who inherit the Spanish crown. It's our turn to run all of the New World colonies. We're going to take over the show. That was kind of the idea. And they fought this incredible war where this called the War of the Spanish Succession, one of the most phenomenal and iconic wars in European history. Just in the what the way the theater of warfare was just brand new, the 1700s, and it would stay kind of the same up till Napoleon, so it wouldn't change much. So it really was defining a new era of warfare. Spain was not really a hot to trot. France is going up against them, and France has its own allies. I think maybe the Prussians are its ally. I don't quite remember. Maybe the Turks. I can't really remember who the French allies were exactly. But the Austrians and the English end up winning, but at like a Pyrrhic victory. Like it's almost not worth all the battles that they fight, because they have really good military leadership. The Duke of Marlborough, and then the Prince Eugene of Savoy, for the Austrians. But Duke of Marlborough is British, and they fight this Battle of Blenheim in like 1704, I think. And it really neutralizes the French. The French are pretty devastated actually in this war, and Louis, the Sun King of France, has to beg like common people to take up arms to help him. He literally goes into like the streets of Versailles or whatever and begs people to help him out, and they do, and they end up sort of realizing a separate peace, less devastating to themselves, and the war is not as they don't have to capitulate as hard. It's not as gruesome for them in the long run as they thought it would be. So the French almost lose everything, but they don't quite lose everything. And the British and the Austrians win, but at a significant diplomatic cost, because now, while they have probably more land under their immediate control in Europe, they do, for whatever reason, I can't quite remember, sadly, that they kind of rescind their claim on the Spanish throne, which means the Bourbons take over. And while they have all this land, they no longer have a claim to the Spanish throne. So the Habsburgs are out of the Spanish Empire, and the Bourbons are installed. And the Holy Roman Empire is out of the Spanish Empire. And now the Spanish Empire is its own thing. It's not the Holy Roman Empire anymore. And it's actually kind of run by the Bourbons. This ruins the Spanish Empire, by the way. Probably the biggest cataclysm, biggest accident for them, because the Bourbons over time replaced the priest-led mission system with a military like presidio system that's basically like localized military dictatorships with a stratigraphy of military hierarchy. The peasants, the work colonies, right? They don't like this. It's because it's abusive, and so slowly but surely, the political ferment circulates, and each of these countries just rebels because they can't handle the inhumanity of that military dictatorship. This isn't like the Arab. It's a little like the Arab Spring, but it actually worked, and it actually worked. And the glory of the Spanish Empire is gone. Right, because the Spanish Empire, what they did was they have all these priests and stuff, but they would also have viceroys, and they had the viceroy of Peru and the viceroy of of New Spain, which became Mexico. And the Viceroy of Peru kind of ran South America, and the Viceroy of New Spain kind of ran Mexico. And Brazil was run by the Portuguese Empire under like Pedro. They had a lot of guys named Peter, right? Was Pedro Peter? Yeah, it is. And eventually, the Portuguese Empire actually decentralizes from, disconnects from Portugal, and the capital moves to Brazil. So Brazil becomes the head of the Portuguese Empire. Um, and a fun fact there, that empire, the reason Portugal, at least at first, the reason Portugal was set up as one clump and the rest of the Spanish lands were set up in like a separate kind of slither around, was that the Borgia Pope, Rodrigo, pulled a line on the map, and that he demarcated the boundary between Portuguese and Spanish territories. And for the most part, despite numerous border conflicts and significant warfare just over the years, that line has kind of stayed sort of the same. And Brazil is still that side, and Spain's still the other side. So it goes to show that maybe the Pope does have some kind of magical power, because he literally decided the lands up until now. And that was in the 1400s, I think. So, okay, so back to the Holy Roman Empire. So now they have to reformulate because they don't have Spain as their they're not really piggybacking off Spain's success anymore. But they do have an incredibly vast claim to overlordship in Central Europe. And, for a long time, they had control in Italy. So they're still thinking about eventually they take Venice. There's still a military force to be reckoned with. Like they conquer Venice because 500 years before then, they actually controlled a lot of Italy with the help of Duchess Matilda and her family. But then they also controlled Bohemia, which was never German, but for some reason they were able to Catholicize that landscape and make the people swear fealty to the Pope, despite the odds, which is impressive. They also quelled the Hungarian invasions, the Bulgarians to a lesser extent. The Polish were quelled and turned into Catholic, and the Danish and all that were quelled. What's quite interesting is the series of wars that the Polish fought against the Austrians in the 1700s, and the Prussians would also fight as sort of in sort of a three-way, Mexican standoff. And at times, the Prussians would ally with the Polish out of convenience. But really, they fought a few wars, and it dwindled. At first, it dwindled the Polish lands and partitioned it. And this has been going on since the 1600s, actually. They had wars that partitioned Poland and gave it and the Russians would take a bunch of land, and the Prussians would take a bunch of land, and the Austrians would take a bunch of land. Because the Austrians, they had nothing better to do. They weren't colonial anymore, or colonial power, so they just had to fight land wars, and they were kind of good at it for a while. But then they had the War of Austrian Succession, where they decided to install a woman as the Empress, Maria Theresa, which seems really dignified and noble. And they did pull it off. They did keep her as Empress, but it allowed all the other countries to just sort of kick them around and basically win land back from them. They had to cede territory to the Prussians, which is the last person they should cede territory to. It's literally their arch rival. And the Poland was, Poland wasn't doing much better. Poland was the only country probably doing worse than Austria at this time, because Poland was originally part of a commonwealth that was religiously diverse. They had Jews and some Muslims there, and Lithuania was a big player, and they were pretty big splat of land. But the Prussians inherited land randomly from the Teutonic Knights. They had a claim because the Teutonic Knights were there, and then they were destroyed. And so the leadership left over, the non-military, but the secular leadership in the Teutonic Knight crusading land was, they took a claim to all that land, despite not having really an exact relationship to it. And they they kind of won it, and then they were allowed to call themselves king even because once you get enough land, you can kind of decide to call yourself a king. You have to have all this money to do it, but you just and be able to secure the land, but you are the king. And so the king of Prussia, it was and the irony is really obvious. Like he used to be limited to being calling himself the king of in Prussia because he owned his land, even though he lived in Brandenburg, which is where Berlin is now. That's why Berlin is important because he was originally from Brandenburg. He also controlled a bunch of lands in Prussia that he had won in some small war, and he had earned the right to be called king in Prussia. But he wasn't the king of Prussia because only when he was in Prussia was he king. When he was in Brandenburg, he was not a king, and it was dicey like that and kind of insulting. But eventually, he got even more land, and then he was allowed to call himself the king of Prussia, and that's how the Prussian kingdom was created in like the 1700s, and eventually it culminates with Frederick the Great. And once you have someone like Frederick the Great around, the Austrians aren't doing that well. The Holy Roman Empire is kind of sandwiched between Prussia and Austria now. And then by the time of Napoleon, both of those guys get gobbled up. And then Poland actually joins Napoleon for the short spurt of adventure that they had together. Anyway, that's part two. I guess I can do an addendum real quick before I get locked out again, because this YouTube just kind of cancels my streams somehow. The Holy Roman Empire lasted until 1805, but in many ways it still exists now, and it exists, in lesser form probably for 100 years or more than 100 years afterward. But the before it totally fell apart, it was always an active cultural force in Europe, even when it wasn't as like the powerhouse empire that it used to be, dominating all these different lands in all different directions and sort of keeping Europe, strong. It had different responsibilities that no scholars like to talk about, but not every common people don't always discuss, which is that Vienna was the music capital of the world. You had Mozart, Beethoven, Vivaldi, I think Brahms at one point, and Haydn, and Franz Schubert. Who am I missing? Yeah. Anyway, so all these famous composers in the 1700s, they had to work in Vienna. It was the best place to work because Joseph the Great of Austria or whatever. I don't think he's called Joseph the Great, and he was really into social reform to the point that no one even agreed with him. They thought he was kind of insane, but he would patronize all these musicians because he thought that was like the utopian thing to do. And so that was another reason that Austria fell apart, is there was a little bit of a decadence problem with its leadership. But Joseph patronized a lot of great composers, especially Mozart, and these are some of the best composers ever. I'll just say, and then and Prussia, which was a part of the Holy Roman Empire, although now was more of its own, by some to be the best composer of all time. By many to be considered the best of all time. And then drop. But whatever, the Holy Netherlands second, who was a Holy Roman Emperor operating out of Bohemia, and mysterious and splendiferous paintings you'll ever see from any royal court in Europe and in any century. And this goes, and I wish I kind of knew more about the gerrymandering with a lot of the land, and for centuries, different linguistic entities, and were always lands that were German. That's a myth that they're speaking some other language, Romance or whatever. And it says a lot about France and Russia that they were able, the Middle Ages for sure, and was the most powerful. And by the time of the early modern period, it was probably, in the top 5. But that's still pretty good. So I'll leave it there. The HRE is not a joke. It was a serious empire. It's just been obfuscated by the fact that the Nazis have made German culture look really, really dumb. The last thing I'll say though is while there is a lot of murder and stuff in the recent German history, if you look at the map during the 40s of the world, a lot of the colonies in Africa, like half of Africa, is either French or British, which is like the peak amount that was ever in terms of division. Some in Italy, but that didn't last. And the Italians are kind of considered like a lightweight occupier. But the Germans and the French, they had hundreds of years of occupation and abuse in these countries. Don't you think that if you stack that into 5-year period, it would be a tantamount to the amount of people the Germans killed in the 40s? I think it would, or at least somewhere along those lines, because they occupied colonies all over the world for a long time and killed a lot of people, and no one's going to deny that part. So yeah, it may not be convenient to conceptualize it that way, but don't think that the British and the French are, you know, doing such, reaching such great heights just by dint of, pure ambition. No, they're killing people, or they were. They were just sneakier about it. And then my favorite ones are probably the Dutch and the Portuguese, because they were always the secondary empires. They were trading empires, and the Portuguese established a lot of the slave trade, which is bad. And it's funny to think about because that's kind of all they're known for. And then the Dutch didn't establish the slave trade, but they probably made the most money off the slave trade because they kind of perpetuated it in the later years. So those empires, they seem like they're all nice. They're not. They very involved in slavery. And I don't have to mention what the catastrophes going on in India and China that the British did, and in Vietnam that the French did. The French were also in India for a while, and where else? There's Australia, there's South America, there's Africa. The Portuguese are in Africa too. The Dutch, of course, are in Africa, South Africa, Indonesia, Dutch, Portuguese. It's all just a lot of going there with guns and pushing people around and taking their goods for shit pay, and then so that wealthy commoners could have tea and sugar in their tea, right? That's all came down to is sugar in the tea and some snuff to throw up the nose, and some powder for the wigs or whatever, some exotic animal teeth for dentures, whatever, to make people comfortable with their self-image, right? That was what those early colonies were up to. Now they probably moved on to a little more dignified activities slightly, but in 30 years we're gonna look at it, it's kind of all the same, aren't we? Anyway, I'll sign off for now. This is part 2. So don't ding or nick the Holy Roman Empire, because in the Middle Ages it was a fairly dignified workhorse, and then later on it really became like the most consequential polity in Europe, because it literally fueled the conservative faction of the Protestant Reformation and revolutions. The Enlightenment was also largely a reaction to the politics of the Holy Roman Empire, and as well as the papal religion, theology. So almost everything going on in the European theater from 1500 to 2000 can be attributed to something going on with Germany or the Holy Roman Empire or Central Europe as a identity, a cohesive identity. All right, that's it. I don't know what else to say. I'll probably write a PDF for you on my website, and then you can learn more about this fascinating topic. I hope I haven't been too dark. I think it's a worthy vindication to learn more about societies that have had a tumultuous past and a fairly elegant one at the right moments.